I grew up with that right from the beginning, so I thought it was like that no matter where you went. I didn't know any different than that. Now, I never had any problems with any of them.
Frankie Valli is 91, but the story of the Four Seasons still raises questions. Behind timeless hits like Sherry and Big Girls Don't Cry lies a history filled with controversy, personal struggles, and rumors that never disappeared. Decades later, fans still debate what really happened behind the music. Today, we uncover the truth behind one of pop music's most mysterious legends. Origins in Newark and the formation of a hit-making identity. Newark in the 1930s and 40s wasn't just a backdrop for Frankie Valli's childhood, it was a pressure chamber. Born Francesco Stephen Castelluccio on May 3, 1934, in the First Ward of Newark, New Jersey, he grew up in a tightly packed Italian-American neighborhood where survival and ambition shared the same streets. His father, Antonio Castelluccio, worked double shifts as a barber and occasional model train display builder, while his mother, Mary, took shifts at a beer company to keep the household stable. In those early years, music was an escape route that most people around him didn't believe existed. The first turning point came not in Newark, but across the river in Manhattan. As a child, Valli was taken to the Paramount Theater to see Frank Sinatra perform live. The experience was formative in a way he would later describe as almost disorienting. A packed theater, controlled silence, and a single voice bending the entire room. Sinatra's early 1940s performances were part of a larger cultural shift, where vocalists began dominating big band arrangements, and for a young boy from Newark, it created a blueprint for what escape could sound like. That night narrowed his future into a single obsession. He would sing to command attention in rooms far larger than his own world. By his teenage years, Valli was already stepping into the professional edges of the music industry. He adopted the stage name Frankie Valli, influenced by Texas Gene Valli, a singer who supported his early career and helped him navigate auditions in New York. Around 1951, he joined Tommy DeVito's early performance outfit, marking the beginning of a partnership that would define much of his career trajectory. The early recording attempts reflected the instability of the time. In 1953, he released My Mother's Eyes under Corona Records, a modest single that failed to chart or generate meaningful commercial traction. The industry landscape at the time was dominated by tightly controlled label systems, where independent artists often cycled through obscure labels without promotion budgets. Valli, like many emerging singers of the period, continued working outside music. His father's barbershop on Madison Avenue remained a parallel world where he was still the barber's son. The group structure around him was equally unstable. Valli worked with shifting configurations that included Tommy DeVito and other local musicians. They performed under names like the Variatones and later the Four Lovers. Each name change represented a reset button. The Four Lovers phase, formed around 1956, marked a brief moment of recording visibility. They achieved minor chart activity with You're the Apple of My Eye, which peaked at number 62 on the Billboard charts. RCA Victor eventually dropped them in 1957. What followed was a fragmentation phase where survival depended on adaptability rather than success. Between 1956 and 1960, the group became a revolving door of identities and contracts. They recorded under at least a dozen variations of their name, including Frankie Valli and the Travelers, Frankie Valli and the Romans, and other short-lived configurations tied to different labels such as OK and Decca. This wasn't artistic experimentation. It was contractual evasion. In the pre-modern rights era of the music industry, artists often had to rebrand entirely to escape binding agreements that restricted them. The turning point toward cohesion arrived in 1960, when Bob Gaudio entered the picture. Gaudio, already known for his earlier hit with the Royal Teens, Short Shorts, 1958, brought something the group had lacked for nearly a decade: structural songwriting discipline. His arrival coincided with a period of exhaustion among the members who were still balancing music with survival jobs and inconsistent bookings. Around the same time, Joe Pesci, then not yet an actor, but part of the New Jersey music circuit, helped reconnect Gaudio with Valli, re-establishing a creative link that would become foundational. The final naming shift occurred almost accidentally. While auditioning for a lounge gig at a bowling alley called The Four Seasons in Union Township, New Jersey, the group failed the audition. But instead of discarding the name, Gaudio recognized its simplicity and memorability. The rejection itself became a branding opportunity. In 1960, the identity of the Four Seasons was formally adopted, marking the end of a long period of instability and the beginning of a structured musical unit. By 1961, they recorded Bermuda under producer George Goldner, but the release failed to gain traction. Yet something had changed structurally. The group was no longer improvising identities. It had a name, a lineup stabilizing around Valli, DeVito, Gaudio, and Nick Massey, and a clearer internal division of roles: lead falsetto, songwriting backbone, harmonic architecture, and rhythmic support. Even before commercial success arrived, the foundation was already locked in. What followed would soon become chart history. But in this early phase, from Newark housing projects to rejected auditions in suburban bowling alleys, the story wasn't about fame. It was about persistence inside a system that constantly resets the scoreboard. Every failed name, every dropped label, and every unpaid gig wasn't a setback. It was another layer in the construction of a group ready to break through. The breakthrough era. The moment everything changed for Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons hit like a signal breaking through static. In 1962, Bob Gaudio, a former teenage hitmaker from the Royal Teens, sat down and wrote a song that would permanently rewire the group's trajectory. The track was Sherry, built around a deceptively simple chord structure and a lead vocal concept designed specifically for Valli's falsetto. Recorded in New York and produced under the guidance of Bob Crewe, Sherry carried a sound that cut through the early 1960s radio landscape with unusual clarity. At a time when American charts were dominated by doo-wop holdovers and emerging British acts were beginning to enter the pipeline, the song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and held that position for 5 consecutive weeks in 1962. It also topped the Cashbox chart, signaling not just popularity, but cross-platform dominance in a fragmented chart system where multiple ranking methodologies coexisted. What made the success structurally significant was its timing. Sherry didn't just chart. It arrived just before the full surge of the British invasion, when acts like the Beatles were still transitioning from UK dominance to US market penetration. This placed the Four Seasons in a rare position, one of the last American vocal groups to achieve uninterrupted chart control before the Atlantic shifted. The record sold in the millions, but more importantly, it established a recognizable sonic identity anchored by Valli's high tenor lead, a sound that stood apart from the guitar-driven rock groups emerging around them. Within months, the group accelerated forward. Big Girls Don't Cry, released later in 1962, followed a similar structural formula but refined it with tighter rhythmic phrasing and sharper lyrical hooks. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and remained there for another 5 weeks, making the Four Seasons one of the few acts in chart history at the time to replace themselves at the top of the rankings. The song also spent 16 weeks on the charts, reflecting not just initial impact, but sustained radio rotation across regional markets. By early 1963, the group had transformed from breakout success into a consistent commercial force. Walk Like a Man, released in March 1963, continued the streak, reaching #1 for 3 consecutive weeks and crossing over into R&B charts, where it peaked at #3. That crossover mattered in a specific historical context. It demonstrated that their sound wasn't confined to pop vocal groups, but could penetrate rhythm and blues audiences at a time when genre boundaries were still rigidly policed by radio programming directors. The production architecture behind this dominance came from an unusually tight creative partnership. Bob Gaudio functioned as the primary composer, while Bob Crewe operated as producer, arranger, and conceptual architect. Crewe, based in New York, had already built a reputation for understanding radio-friendly structures, And his collaboration with Gaudio created a production pipeline that could generate hits at an unusual speed. Together, they crafted not just individual songs, but a repeatable formula: high-register lead vocals, tightly layered harmonies, and percussion-driven arrangements that emphasized rhythm over orchestral depth. Between 1962 and 1964, this system produced a continuous chain of successful releases. Ragdoll, Ronnie, Bye Bye Baby. Each release reinforced the group's chart presence and expanded their national reach across AM radio networks, which were the primary drivers of music consumption in the United States at the time. Unlike many contemporaries who relied on touring to build momentum, the Four Seasons were being built directly through radio frequency saturation. The scale of their dominance became more visible in the broader industry context. By 1963, American charts were undergoing rapid transformation due to the British invasion, with the Beatles entering the U.S. market in early 1964 and quickly reshaping commercial expectations. Yet the Four Seasons maintained a rare continuity of American chart presence during this transition, effectively acting as one of the last major domestic vocal groups to compete at the top level before British rock acts began to dominate the Billboard landscape. Behind the scenes, the success also reflected a highly efficient production model. Gaudio and crew could move from composition to recording to release in compressed cycles, sometimes producing charting singles within weeks of each other. This rapid turnaround was unusual, even by the 1960s standards, and allowed the group to maintain momentum in a volatile market. Another defining factor was Frankie Valli's vocal identity. His falsetto was not just stylistic, it was structural. In a radio environment crowded with baritone-heavy male groups and emerging rock instrumentation, his upper register delivery created immediate sonic differentiation. Engineers and producers leaned into this, mixing his voice forward in tracks so that it cut through transistor radio limitations, which were common in early 1960s consumer listening devices. By mid-1963, the Four Seasons were no longer operating as a breakthrough act. They had become a dominant chart entity. They were one of the few American groups consistently competing at #1 status, while the industry itself was undergoing an international shift. Their records were not just popular, they were engineered for repeat consumption, designed to reappear across playlists, jukebox rotations, and regional radio programming cycles. The Four Seasons' peak breakout period existed in a narrow window between two major phases: the decline of early 1960s vocal pop groups and the rise of British rock dominance. In that gap, they achieved multiple #1 records, sustained national visibility, and an identity that could reliably generate hits. They were no longer chasing recognition. They had already become part of the chart infrastructure itself. But something else was also happening, away from the eyes of the public. Internal financial structure and industry exploitation. By the time the Four Seasons were stacking #1 hits in the early 1960s, the sound coming out of radios told one story, while the accounting books told another. Behind Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, and Walk Like a Man, there was a financial structure built in an era when record labels and producers didn't just market music, they owned most of it. Frankie Valli and his group weren't unusual in this system. They were, in fact, textbook examples of how success could be separated from ownership. The early 1960s music industry in the United States operated on contracts that heavily favored labels such as VJ Records, which initially distributed the Four Seasons breakout material, and publishing entities tied to producers. Artists typically signed agreements that transferred publishing rights, the most valuable long-term income source, to writers, producers, or affiliated companies. That meant even when a record reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the majority of royalties flowed away from the performers and toward the songwriters and publishers. In the case of the Four Seasons, the internal financial architecture was shaped largely by Bob Gaudio and Bob Crew. Gaudio as the primary songwriter and Crew as producer and publishing strategist controlled a significant portion of the group's catalog revenue. Crew was not just producing records in the studio on West 57th Street in New York. He was also embedded in the publishing side of the business, where long-term royalties were structured. Gaudio's songwriting credits, meanwhile, ensured that a substantial share of mechanical royalties from record sales, radio play, and later licensing flowed to him as composer, rather than equally to the performing members. This structure created a layered revenue system. On paper, the Four Seasons were generating massive sales volumes, millions of singles within a short period between 1962 and 1964. Sherry alone spent 5 weeks at #1 and became one of the defining records of the era. But gross sales figures did not translate into evenly distributed income. Record companies typically recouped production, marketing, and distribution costs before paying out artist fractions of a cent per unit sold. The imbalance was amplified by publishing control. Songs like Big Girls Don't Cry and Walk Like a Man were not just performance hits, they were publishing assets. Whoever controlled the songwriting credits controlled the long-term income stream from radio syndication, cover versions, and licensing. In this system, performers without writing credits often earned significantly less over time than the public perception of their success suggested. Within the group itself, this created a quiet but persistent structural divide. Frankie Valli, as lead vocalist and public face, was central to the group's identity, but the financial machinery behind the hits was increasingly tied to Gaudio and crew's writing and production roles. This was not unusual in the 1960s pop ecosystem. Many vocal groups, particularly those emerging from doo-wop and early rock and roll traditions, entered contracts where creative control and financial ownership were consolidated outside the performing lineup. The broader industry context made this even more pronounced. During this era, music publishing companies were often more profitable than record sales themselves. A single hit song could generate decades of revenue through radio airplay, television usage, and later licensing in films or commercials. But those rights were typically locked in at the time of recording, when artists had limited leverage and minimal legal protection. Contract negotiation power was heavily skewed toward labels, especially for groups that were newly successful and lacked experienced legal representation. For the Four Seasons, the rapid rise from obscurity to chart dominance meant their early agreements were signed under pressure conditions, when the priority was getting records released quickly enough to maintain momentum. That urgency often came at the expense of long-term financial structure. As a result, even though the group achieved multiple consecutive #1 hits in a short span, their share of revenue was distributed unevenly across different layers of the production chain. Bob Crew's role further illustrates how income flowed through production hierarchies. As producer and publisher, Crew was positioned at the intersection of creative output and financial control. He shaped arrangements, supervised studio sessions in New York, and controlled aspects of song placement and distribution. This meant that revenue from a single hit could be split across performers, writers, producers, publishers, and label intermediaries before reaching individual group members. Over time, this structure created a reality that became increasingly common among successful 1960s acts. Visibility did not equal wealth parity. Many performers discovered years later that while their records had sold in the millions, their personal earnings were constrained by early contractual terms that did not scale with success. The Four Seasons were not an exception to this pattern. This financial disconnect also influenced internal group dynamics. As revenue streams became more complex and unevenly distributed, decision-making increasingly centered around those controlling publishing rights and production roles. The performing members, while essential to the sound and public identity of the group, had less influence over the underlying financial architecture. By the mid-1960s, the industry itself began shifting. Artist rights awareness slowly increased, and later generations of musicians would negotiate for better royalty structures and publishing ownership. But for the Four Seasons' peak years, the system they operated in was still heavily weighted toward labels and producers who controlled both the recording process and the monetization of music. As if this were not enough, more trouble was brewing. Tommy DeVito's gambling debts and exit from the group. By the late 1960s, the Four Seasons were no longer the clean-cut chart machine of Sherry and Walk Like a Man. Behind the touring schedule and radio residuals, the group was tightening under financial strain that wasn't visible to audiences. At the center of that pressure was Tommy DeVito, a founding member whose role in the group's early identity had shifted from guitarist and vocalist to a liability shaped by gambling losses that would eventually reshape the entire lineup. DeVito's gambling issues are consistently described in historical accounts of the group as a long-developing pattern rather than a sudden collapse. Throughout the 1960s, he was active in New Jersey's gambling circuits, particularly card games and horse betting, which were deeply embedded in the nightlife culture of the time. In that era, informal credit systems, often extending from loan-sharking networks, allowed high-stakes gambling to continue even when cash reserves ran out. It was within this system that DeVito accumulated what multiple retrospective accounts estimate as roughly $150,000 to $160,000 in debt, a staggering figure for the late 1960s and one that would have carried significant pressure from creditors operating outside formal banking structures. This financial burden did not exist in isolation. By the mid to late 1960s, the group itself was transitioning away from its peak chart dominance. While hits continued, the broader musical landscape was shifting rapidly. The British invasion had already altered radio programming priorities, and American vocal groups were competing against guitar-driven rock bands with stronger touring economies. For the Four Seasons, this meant more work for less proportional return, even as their catalog remained commercially active. Internally, the group's structure began absorbing the stress in uneven ways. Frankie Valli remained the central voice and public identity. Bob Gaudio was increasingly focused on songwriting and production, and Nick Massey contributed harmonic structure. DeVito, however, became increasingly entangled in financial instability that required attention beyond music. Touring income that once might have stabilized personal finances was no longer sufficient to offset accumulated debt pressures, especially when repayment demands began to intensify through informal channels. It is consistently reported across biographies and music histories that the debt load became unsustainable. In the absence of formal bankruptcy protections for informal gambling debts, repayment structures were often negotiated directly, sometimes through intermediaries familiar with both entertainment and lending networks in New Jersey. Meanwhile, internal group tensions also increased. The Four Seasons were operating under a business model that required constant touring, recording, and administrative coordination, and any instability in one member's personal finances could affect the group's ability to function smoothly. DeVito's situation gradually shifted from being a personal issue to a structural concern. His reliability as a touring and performing member became increasingly difficult to sustain under the weight of external obligations. By around 1970, the situation reached a decisive turning point. DeVito exited the group, marking the end of his direct involvement in the Four Seasons performing lineup. His departure was not framed publicly in dramatic terms at the time, but later accounts indicate that it was effectively a financial and structural separation. He sold or relinquished his stake in the group's name and future earnings, stepping away from the ongoing business structure that would continue to generate revenue through touring and catalog sales. This transition was significant, not just for personnel reasons, but for ownership continuity. The Four Seasons, unlike many earlier vocal groups, had evolved into a structured business entity tied to publishing, performance rights, and long-term royalties. DeVito's exit meant the consolidation of control among the remaining members and their management structure. In practical terms, it reduced the number of claimants on future income streams, simplifying the group's financial architecture during a period of ongoing industry change. After leaving, DeVito's trajectory diverged sharply from the group's continued commercial evolution. While Frankie Valli and Bob Gaudio moved into new phases of production, songwriting, and later solo and collaborative work, DeVito's association with the mainstream music industry diminished. Reports from later years place him in various work contexts outside the high-profile touring circuit, reflecting a common pattern among 1960s musicians who exited major groups without sustained royalty-based income streams. The broader significance of DeVito's departure lies in how it reflects the intersection of personal financial behavior and structural industry pressures. The Four Seasons were already operating within a system where royalties, publishing rights, and management control were tightly concentrated. DeVito's gambling debts only made things more complicated. But was he really involved with the mob? Well, let's answer that question now. Organized crime environment and Gyp DeCarlo connection. By the time Frankie Valli and the early Four Seasons were fighting for bookings in New Jersey and New York, the music was coming out of an ecosystem where entertainment, money, and informal power structures often overlapped. The late 1950s and early 1960s club circuit in the New York metropolitan area included hundreds of venues ranging from legitimate ballrooms to small lounges, where booking control, ticket cuts, and protection arrangements were frequently influenced by organized crime-linked figures. For emerging acts like the Four Seasons, this environment was the operational backdrop of almost every gig. In northern New Jersey specifically, venues in Newark, Jersey City, and surrounding towns were part of a dense performance network where access to stages often depended on intermediaries rather than direct artist-to-venue relationships. Booking agents, club managers, and so-called fixers operated in overlapping spaces, and disputes over contracts or payment sometimes required outside mediation. It was within this landscape that Angelo "Gyp" DeCarlo became a recognizable name. DeCarlo was associated with the DeCavalcante crime family, a Newark-based organized crime group that law enforcement later identified as one of the major mafia families operating in New Jersey during that era. DeCarlo's role in the entertainment world was not as a manager in the formal sense, but as an intermediary who could resolve conflicts or smooth disputes involving bookings and club operations. He had enough influence to step into situations where financial disagreements or management tensions needed resolution. The Four Seasons were among the acts operating in this environment, and DeCarlo was known to them through the broader club circuit connections that defined the regional music industry at the time. What is important to separate from this environment, however, is formal control. There is no verified evidence in court records, government investigations, or authoritative biographies that the Four Seasons were ever owned, managed, or contractually controlled by organized crime. Their recording contracts were issued through mainstream music industry channels, including labels like VJ Records and Philips Records, and their songwriting and production partnerships were structured through professional arrangements involving Bob Gaudio and producer Bob Crew. The presence of organized crime influence in the venues they performed in does not equate to organizational control over the group itself. The distinction becomes clearer when examining how disputes were actually resolved. In the club circuit ecosystem, conflicts over payment delays, booking priority, or management disagreements were often handled informally. Figures like DeCarlo could intervene as mediators, but this role was situational rather than contractual. In the case of the Four Seasons, references to DeCarlo typically center around his involvement in resolving tensions tied to management relationships and performance arrangements, rather than any direct involvement in creative or financial control of the group's output. The group's internal financial and ownership arrangement had to be restructured following Tommy DeVito's departure around 1970. DeVito exited after accumulating significant personal gambling debt, and his share of the group's future earnings and name rights was effectively relinquished or bought out as part of his exit from the organization. Well, this closes one chapter. But what about the main character? How did Frankie Valli move on? In interviews over the years, Frankie Valli has repeatedly emphasized that he just kept going. "I never thought I'd have a hit record," he once said about the early days, And that same understated tone follows him into later reflections on everything that came after: the fame, the fractures, and the years of turbulence that never fully left the story. After Tommy DeVito's departure, the Four Seasons no longer functioned as a fixed lineup, but as a rotating, legacy-driven act anchored by his voice. Bob Gaudio gradually stepped back from constant touring to focus on songwriting and production, while Valli became the consistent public identity of the group. Even in this transitional period, Valli still achieved major success outside the group's original peak. In 1975, My Eyes Adored You reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, marking a rare solo chart resurgence more than a decade after the group's breakthrough era. Meanwhile, earlier hits like Can't Take My Eyes Off You gained long-term cultural traction through radio, film, and licensing, keeping his voice relevant across generations. The Four Seasons continued touring in various configurations, increasingly functioning as a nostalgia-driven live act, performing in theaters and large venues. His personal life was equally complex. Valli has been married 4 times. His first marriage to Mary lasted 13 years and ended in 1971. They had 2 daughters, and he also raised her daughter from a previous relationship. In 1980, both his stepdaughter and younger daughter died in separate tragedies. He married Marianne Hannigan in 1974, with that marriage lasting 8 years, and later married Randy Clohessy in 1984, with whom he had 3 sons before divorcing in 2004. A legal dispute from that marriage reached the Supreme Court of California, which ruled that a 2003 life insurance policy was community property. His family connections also remained intertwined with his career. His daughter was briefly married to Four Seasons member Jerry Polsey, and their daughter, Olivia Polsey, became a stage actress, later portraying her grandmother Mary in a 2019 Jersey Boys production. In 2023, Valli married Jackie Jacobs in Las Vegas, and the couple now resides in Encino, California. In later years, he also obtained a restraining order against his eldest son due to threats of violence, reflecting ongoing family tensions. Even now, at 91, Valli is still publicly tied to the Four Seasons legacy, still performing and still responding to questions about an era that refuses to settle into a single version of truth. He has addressed the rumors, the dramatizations, and the mob-adjacent mythology in different interviews over time, often pushing back gently rather than aggressively. His stance has remained consistent. The music was real, the struggles were real, but much of the surrounding narrative has been exaggerated or reshaped over time through retellings and stage adaptations. What stands out in his reflections is not a sense of closure, but continuity. He has described performing as something instinctive rather than historical, less about revisiting the past and more about staying connected to what he built. Even as Jersey Boys turned his life into a global stage production, he has remained slightly outside its mythology, watching a version of his story expand beyond his own voice. Frankie Valli, at 91, continues forward, while the story around him keeps expanding in different directions, part fact, part memory, part performance. The mystery has outlived the era that created it. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.